My name's Martine. I'm the program manager for Pivot Northwest, and we're convening this meeting. Let me introduce Jeff Cuse. He's the executive director at Pivot, and he'll kind of set the table, as it were, for what we're going to be doing tonight.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Again, as Martine said, my name is Jeff Cuse. I'm a faculty member here at Seattle Pacific University, and on behalf of SPU, thanks for taking time to come indoors as opposed to being in one of the most glorious days that we get. So getting Seattleites indoors on a day like this is a huge task, so thank you for being here. As Martine mentioned, I'm the executive director and principal investigator for Pivot Northwest, and I just wanted to give you a little snapshot of what we are for those of you who are new to this meeting and what we're doing. Pivot Northwest is established by a generous grant from the Lilly Foundation, and our remit really is to service and to call out faith communities and community members towards innovation for the sake of 22 to 29-year-olds. Real basic line there, but our real kind of big question is, how do we bridge generations, how do we bridge organizations, and how do we create deep roots for people of meaning in our Pacific Northwest region? And so one of the things that we do is we work with faith communities, and many churches here that we are represented are some of the churches we've been working with on a journey to help them innovate who they are and their identity. But then also, this is one of our public-facing events where we want to kind of bring people in from a lot of different parts who create care in our communities to talk to each other, to meet each other around what we're kind of calling pop-up incidents. You know, if you talk about pop-up shops that happen, this is a pop-up question tonight, is Millennial Philanthropy. When we threw out the question of what would it mean to talk about Millennial Philanthropy, everybody says, I don't know, but we got to talk about it, right? It was all of a sudden a really interesting question just putting that together. What does it mean for a generation to steward their resources and time well, is kind of the question. And who can we talk to about that? So tonight, I'm going to invite Kathy up. Kathy is with World Vision. I'm going to let her talk a little bit about her remit. Kathy just completed her doctorate at George Fox University, and she's going to be sharing some of her research tonight on this question. Kathy comes to us, as I mentioned, from World Vision, done a lot of work as far as reaching out on this question, and really is kind of, when we started having conversations together about this evening, she just lit up and says, this is one of my big passions, is how to help people really envision what it means to think about philanthropy for next generation. So we're so thankful that Kathy's with us. So let's give it up for Kathy as she shares with us tonight.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Is my mic on? Am I loud enough for you? Well, good evening. I'm so excited to talk about millennials and millennial philanthropy tonight. I just graduated. I figured out that it was exactly 1 month ago. So some of these activities and things that we're going to do tonight, we're trying for the first time. So I appreciate your grace for me, and we'll just kind of maybe learn some things together as we go through the evening. Does that sound good? Yep, great. Well, everyone seems to have an opinion on millennials, even millennials themselves. So I had asked Martine if he would just go out and ask some pastors and millennials some questions and just see what they say. So we would like to start by just showing you this quick.
What do you think, as a pastor, what do you think millennials think of you or pastors in general?
A little bit of culturally out of touch. Talks too long and could narrow down his sermon some.
As a pastor, how do you think millennials view you and pastors in general?
Oh my goodness. Maybe they think we're outdated, not focused on the right things as the church. I would say they would probably assume that we're not focused on the right things as a church for today.
I think millennials want authenticity. Mm-hmm. So if a pastor is authentically committed, even if they completely disagree with what that pastor is talking about, if there's authenticity and consistency and a willingness to listen, I think there's a high view. If there's a sense of being closed off or using power against another instead of to encourage and promote another, then there's a suspicion. of them. And most millennials I know, if a pastor's trying too hard to be too cool, there's not a lot of patience for that. And so, see, I don't try to be cool. So they really like me. I just think they have a pretty quick BS meter.
So when you think of pastors, what are the first thoughts that come to your mind?
White man.
All right. Anything else? What are your first thoughts when you think of pastors?
White men. Hypocritical. That's bad.
Yeah.
Not always, but
Let me preface it by also saying we are church-going folk.
yeah.
That's
But
fine.
we also recognize all the problems in the church, and I think here, like, if we're talking about like here in Seattle,
Sure.
pastors here, I get the sense are very inclusive,
Yeah.
very loving, they recognize, that like there is a disparity between like white people and people of color, and like men and women, and like straight people and gay people. I feel like in Seattle, like, at least in my experience, pastors have done a pretty good job of trying to navigate that divide. But if we're talking in general, they need to do better. Like, if we're talking about just like if we're talking about like America in general,
I agree.
they're doing a pretty shit job at it. Oh, I'm sorry. Am I allowed to swear?
You're fine.
Okay, cool.
All right.
my
the
answer.
Next question. What do you think pastors think of you all as 20-somethings?
Millennials.
People in their 20s being a lot more liberal-leaning Christians, and I think, in my experience, I think a lot of pastors just don't really get that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We're too outspoken.
Yeah.
So pastors look at millennials as unfavorable?
I would say probably unfavorable.
Okay. Anything else?
No.
I feel like it depends on the pastor or the person, but just like from my church and like our pastor and stuff, I feel like he sees us as like people with potential to like thrive and like do good in the world. It's like I feel like in TV shows and stuff like that, they kind of show pastors as looking down on millennials and stuff because like they're sinning and all that good stuff. But I don't think of it that way. I think they're just like there to like help us, and they just want the best for us, I think.
Well, interesting, huh? I wondered if there might be some bias and what those biases were, or some reverse bias going on. So it's kind of interesting to see what people said. Well, today we're going to be talking about millennial giving and engagement. And I'll be sharing some of my research with you. But before we start, some of tonight is just going to be about having conversations and engaging with each other. So before I start, what I'd like to do is just at your table groups, if you could just spend 5 minutes getting to know each other. So even if you already know each other, go around and just say your name, maybe where you work, and then also why you're here tonight. If there are certain things that you came hoping to learn, if you could share that with your group, that would be great. And that will help me later make sure that I get your questions answered. Whether it's during my presentation or I can meet with you afterwards. So let's just take 5 minutes, introduce yourselves, and then I might have one person from each group to stand up and tell me some of the things they heard from their group about why they're here tonight. All right, let's go ahead. All right. What I'd like to do, this will help me to make sure I'm addressing your questions, is if we could have, we've got Martine and Jeff will have mics. If we could just have one person from each table stand up and just maybe share a couple of the things you heard of why people are here tonight. And it's okay to say there's food and air conditioning. That's why I'm here. So that'll help me. So whichever table wants to go first is fine. Do we start here? Sure.
So our group is composed of people who are involved in nonprofits. Can you hear me anyway?
Go ahead and talk. Yeah, you're doing great.
I can hear you.
So most of us are involved with nonprofits serving a population in a different country, Guatemala and Rwanda. And we're getting older, and we need to learn how to communicate with and inspire millennials to replace us. And we need to create the next generation of leaders of our organization, the next generation of donors for our organization, people to do the work, because we'll wear out someday. And if we really love the people we serve, we've got to take care of them by ensuring sustainability of the organization. So I think communication was key. Understanding the priorities of millennials was key. And did I miss anything? Okay, turning off now.
Thank you.
So we were talking to Magdiel and Uriel, and I was like, oh, hey, so what do you do? Do you work? Do you do ministry? Do you study? They're like, yes, we do all three. And so I think that's also speaking to what it's like to be a millennial these days, is to be more than bivocational, maybe even like tri-vocational. And I think speaking to something in the video earlier, there's not a white male at this table today, and I think it's also a sign of who is coming up and actually trying to seek a place in ministry is actually people of color, and so I think that's really cool.
Awesome, thank you. How about down here in front? Calling you out.
I'm Reed. I'm a millennial, and No, we're from Bethany Presbyterian Church, and so we're all here for this very reason, to try to learn how to connect better with the millennial cohort and to engage them in giving at the church, to have a strong foundation around that.
Great, thank you. How about this table here? Or yeah, in the back, it's great.
Hi, my name is Sam Irungu, and I work with World Vision. The reason that's why part of my coming here is, first of all, also kind of get to interact with, and listen through some of the many ways that we can be able to engage these young people. But also growing up as a young person, based on my background, and being on the receiving end, I kind of have come to learn that understanding the language of the young people, understanding what they like most, and putting those small triggers that could present them to a way of giving and packaging the way of engaging them has come very important. The other thing that I kind of noted is when I usually speak out in this kind of conversation or these kind of meetings, I find myself sometimes in the receiving end because either I'm speaking differently, but I've come to realize if I spend time with people, the young people, and place value into them and add my thoughts into them, it becomes something that they get ignited to listen through. When they get to know you, once they get to kind of understand where you're coming from, that catches their attention. And that has been great for me because I've been able to engage them in one way or the other. However, kind of understanding the trends on how they understand things, especially with IT and all that, has also been something that has been elusive. And as I continue understanding that, and as a group here, we kind of realize when we have these young people coming and growing, we also need to understand how are they being taught out there, who are they engaging with, and from that we'll be able to kind of present stuff to do with giving and how they can engage in some of this philanthropy work. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see, this table here. I know Randy's not shy.
Yeah, hi, I'm Randy, an employee of World Vision here, and I think what everyone has already covered is pretty much covered our table's topics and interests, just to get to know millennials and to be able to understand what motivates and how to be relevant and how to engage and how to inspire each other for greater good and really purpose-driven work and ministry.
Great, thank you. I guess we have 2 tables left.
And again?
I'm part of a downtown church. We're a church plant, and so I get to be the finance gal, unfortunately. But I think we're similar to everybody else, just trying to figure out what will engage the millennials. We attract our small church has a majority millennials. And so we're just trying to figure out how do we engage them to like want to serve, to love the city, to, pour out generosity to others. I mean, and so we just really are stumped by that. So I'm hoping to learn from all of you on what you do.
Great, thank you.
I'm going to put Erica on the spot.
I should have seen that coming. My name is Erica. I'm from Renew Covenant Church up in Linwood, and every other Wednesday we have women's group. And so I emailed our women and I said, you guys want to do this instead of women's group? And they said, yeah, let's do it. So we all know each other. And I think we didn't get all the way around because we know each other, so we talk a lot. But of those of us who are millennials at the table, there's definitely some obvious feeling of defensiveness coming in. Not because we don't trust Pivot, but because most of when people are engaging with what is a millennial, what do they think, those sorts of things, it's most often negative. And we are entitled, or we are lazy, or we don't give, or whatever it might be. And so I think coming to something like this, there were at least a few of us that were like, what are they going to say? What are they going to say about us? But also, one thing that I appreciate about the women from my church is just a really strong desire to learn. And being a younger church and a church that's less than 2 years in the location that we're in, we're so ready to learn about how we can engage the neighborhood in ways that are different than what we're used to, or in ways that connect people to a family, a church family, in ways that maybe, I'm just rambling, but that I didn't experience growing up because of the way that these things weren't talked about. This is the right way to give. This is the only way to support your church financially. So a lot of us here, I think, we're here to learn about this stuff.
Great. Well, this is awesome. So we're all here to learn together. And Erica, I have to tell you, I was asked recently to speak at chapel to our whole staff, which was sort of terrifying. There's like 2,000 employees or something, I don't know. And when I was done, my mailbox was flooded with emails from millennials saying, thank you for saying positive things about us. And I believe those things. So I appreciate that. Thank you for sharing that. So let's see if we can answer some of your questions and address some of the things you talked about. Let's talk about millennials a little bit. What will happen if 10 years from now, your church or your organization has not figured out how to engage the millennial generation? This generation is actually becoming right now the prime income earners in the United States, with the oldest members of this generation being in their mid to late 30s. So if you use a range of 1980 to 2000, different research fuzzes it a little bit, but that's about the range. These are the prime income earners in the United States, or at least they're moving into that area. And in the case of World Vision, where I work, if we don't figure out how to engage this generation, that loss of revenue could actually result in the deaths of the people we serve. So today we're going to talk about how nonprofits and churches can engage the millennials in giving, but also in engagement in general. I've spent the last 3 years studying millennials, specifically related to nonprofit giving, but my doctorate is in leadership and spiritual formation, so I'm very interested in their spiritual formation tied to that. And spoiler alert, the place we want to get to tonight is empathy. And in a few minutes, we're going to do an activity to kind of have a little experience with that. And it's a good way to get, this activity is a good way to get there pretty quickly. But we can't truly understand why empathy matters to millennials without first understanding millennials a little bit. So why do we need to engage millennials in our work? Well, today, right now, 25 million people face a hunger crisis in East Africa. And today, it's 7:30. We're about halfway through a 24-hour period. 8,000 children have died today from curable health-related issues like diarrhea or malnutrition. 1 in 10 people today still do not have access to clean water. And we need the tithe to continue the good work of the church. Well, God has given us the tools and the people to do something about these things. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, you gave me a drink. I was homeless, and you took me in. We find Jesus with the poor. And for those of us that work in the nonprofit field and that are out, I was just in Kenya a month ago, that are out in the field with the poor are hungry and they're thirsty, and they need a place to lay their heads at night. As a matter of fact, there are over 65 million refugees today who've been forced from their homes, just to give you a little idea. Now, churches and nonprofits need financial gifts to meet the needs of the marginalized, the oppressed, those without a voice, those we serve. The boomer generation, unfortunately, is aging out. I'm at the youngest end of that boomer generation. And Xers, Generation X, is not giving at the same level that the boomer generation was. And now some churches and nonprofits are failing to engage potential millennial donors and givers, which poses a huge challenge, as some of you mentioned, going forward in serving the people that we serve. Data shows that if nonprofits don't figure out how to engage millennials consistently, the death rate of children under the age of 5 will begin to rise again by the year 2030. Each of our organizations will experience negative impact if we don't figure out how to engage this generation. So the question is, how can Christian organizations engage millennials in their mission and increase consistent giving by members of this important generation? I love this picture. People love to talk about millennials. You just mentioned some of the things. Is this a lazy generation? Is this the entitled generation? Is this the self-absorbed generation? Is this the I want a hug because I showed up to work today generation? We've all heard these things, admit it. Is this the, let's see, it's jumping ahead on its own, Martine. So can I have you do it? I'm not touching it and it's moving. So is this the I plan to live in my parents' basement till I'm 40 generation? Well, actually, no, it is not. This, you can do the next one, Martine. This is the tiny house generation. They are not superficial. This is the social justice generation. They want to change the world. And let me tell you, they have the skills to do it. This is the savvy generation. This generation has been marketed to since they could walk. And this is the informed generation. This is the most highly educated generation in history. Some facts. Millennials are a little bit impulsive. This impulsivity does bring in gifts to help the poor, but it means that their giving is inconsistent, according to the data that I pulled during my research. Which also means that any spiritual development that comes along with giving consistently in a committed way to an organization or a church, that spiritual development is somewhat limited when the giving is sporadic. And research shows, though, that there are ways to increase consistency in millennial giving. Millennials are connected. You can advance that, Martine. Understanding their communication norms increases consistency in millennial giving. And affirming their identities as charitable does as well. The good and the bad news about millennials being connected: when we do something that they perceive to be good in the world, they will tell their friends. We lie to them, they will tell their friends. Because millennials are savvy, you can advance that, Martine, and have access to instant information, they want transparency and authenticity, and they don't want to be what they refer to as Bible thumped. They've watched previously trusted leaders, including clergy, fall from grace. They won't just believe us because we say so. Do millennials lack empathy? Some studies say that they do, citing digital versus in-person relationships, but could it be that society in general is becoming more narcissistic? and less empathetic. Maybe millennial empathy just looks different. And my research shows that in many cases, empathy can be learned. So maybe this social justice generation will actually move us toward a more empathetic age. I believe that it will. So what if rather than trying to adjust millennials to fit our communication style, we adjusted to theirs? They care, it just looks different. Millennials love stories, for example, but they want to respond financially immediately, and they want to do it on their mobile phones. I have donor partners that I work with that even want their reporting on their mobile phones. And they want experiences. What might that look like? So here's one idea: unlikely and unfiltered conversations. I believe that greater organizational transparency combined with interactive human engagement, both digitally and in person, will spark millennial interest and empathy, and it will increase committed giving by this generation. Well, there are things we need to understand about how millennials want to engage. They want to learn from older generations. This was a surprise to me. I thought they might say that they didn't, but they actually said that they do. I have the data to prove it. And they want to share what they know with older generations. They value sharing. They want to hear and be heard. They want conversations, not a monologue, but a dialogue. Both the Pivot research and my research found that in churches where the lead pastor shows up at young adult group or at their community groups and just sits down and has a conversation with them, those churches are seeing consistency in millennial attendance or even an increase in millennial attendance versus churches where the only time they hear from the lead pastor is from the pulpit on Sunday. One of the solutions that came up in my research, I had 3 that I came up with, but one of them was intergenerational mentoring and reverse mentoring. But it must include reverse mentoring. They won't do it unless it's really, truly a two-way conversation. Otherwise, it doesn't work. And in my research, I found that with millennials who had an intergenerational relationship growing up, not with a family member, but someone in the church, so an intergenerational relationship in their church growing up, those millennials are either staying in the church or coming back to the church, versus millennials that never had an intergenerational relationship in their church. And millennials love to share. As I mentioned, if you ask them, they'll share online or in person, and they want the organizations that they partner with to do the same. Millennials are ready to hear and discuss the whole story, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I've had conversations with millennials where they will look for organizations that take the negative comments off their social media feeds and put them on the bottom. The first place they look is going to be the bottom. So they want the whole story, the honest, transparent truth. If they trust you, they'll share with their friends. Data shows that millennials form groups of 4 to 5, generally with one leading and the others following. Researchers tried to market to all 5. It didn't work. Market to the leader, they will tell their friends and engage their friends. Millennials are social. And what if this transparent, interactive, two-way conversation experience sparked spiritual formation? What might that look like? What if we were intentional about that as we built experiences? What if we affirmed the millennial generation's social norms, such as their propensity for social justice? Might they begin to see themselves as children of a God who loves the poor? And might they begin to see their face in the faces of unlikely others? So here are some things that we've learned. We need to allow millennials to share what they know. You can advance that, Martine. We need to affirm their social norms. We need to give them opportunities for unfiltered conversations with our leaders, our donors, our beneficiaries, maybe our elders in the church, just unfiltered conversations. And we need to do it without hiding things. No unrealistic standards and no sugarcoating. And I've learned some things that millennials don't want. They don't want expensive galas. They love meaningful gatherings, and they enjoy fundraisers. But this generation will count the cost of that big band, and they will be adding up the dollars associated with that catering. And they don't want you to ask them for money without offering other ways to engage with your organization. Hands-on experience, whether that means advocacy, volunteering, mentoring, that elicits trust. And trust elicits deeper engagement. So we know that millennials want authenticity. We know they want transparency. And they want hands-on experiences. My research shows that pro-social behavior, so pro-social behavior is behavior where we're getting together with others for the purpose of good. So it might be good for an individual, for a community, or for a society as a whole. So that means activities such as helping, sharing, giving, cooperating, volunteering. Pro-social behavior increases empathy. And research by Professors Kim and Cow and a whole bunch of other research that I found shows that when empathy goes up, giving goes up. I believe that if we want to engage millennials, we need to facilitate unlikely and unfiltered conversations. These human connections allow an opportunity for empathy, and they affirm our alikeness as human beings, made in the image of God. And they remove the perceived filter of church or nonprofit where, let's be honest, we have sometimes changed or altered the story to control the outcome that we want. We've sometimes rewritten the story to suit our own purposes. So how then do we facilitate a conversation? What does it look like to invite someone into a conversation and maybe a relationship, to abide in them the way God abides in us, to remain in them the way God remains in us? And are we demonstrating God's love for us as we move around in the world and we interact with others? Well, one way to demonstrate God's love is through conversations. You can go to the StoryCorps, there you go. There are organizations that will help facilitate conversations. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. Churches and nonprofit could use those resources, or if they want to, they could create their own. Most of you are familiar with StoryCorps, which I love. It says on their website, creates opportunities for people to have a conversation, build connections, learn to listen, and hopefully create a more compassionate world. Another great example is the Human Library. Did you know that you can go to libraries all over the US and check out a human library book? People volunteer to be a library book, and you can go in, check them out, sit down, and just have a conversation with them. So the library book might be a refugee, it might be a domestic violence survivor, it might be a recovering alcoholic, it might be somebody who lived through the tribal wars in another country, a homeless person. So you can just sit down, check the library book out, and talk to them. That's a great activity too, which will increase empathy and increase really spiritual formation as well. And it also demonstrates our shared humanity as we talk with one another, somebody that might look or sound differently than we. And organizations that aren't able to facilitate experiences like this, where it's one-on-one, face-to-face experiences, those organizations could create something that's online, like a portal where maybe you could have a conversation with someone who's living in a third world country. One way to do this is through Skype or something like HoloLens technology that Microsoft has created. I mean, what if a US millennial could go for a walk to fetch water with somebody living in Zambia and have a conversation while they're doing it? HoloLens has that ability. Or have a live conversation on Skype with someone who's a missionary in China and be able to ask them, what is that like? Have a conversation. Mahatma Gandhi said, in a gentle way, you can shake the world. Well, I believe this gentle shaking can happen through simple human interaction. If we can come up with opportunities for millennials to meet someone who might look different than they do or sound different than they do, they'll experience empathy toward that person. The world will become smaller, and they will engage and respond. So a lot of what I've been talking about tonight is really about sharing our stories with one another, having conversations with one another. So in a minute, we're going to do an activity where we get to share stories. So I thought I would kick us off by sharing just kind of a funny personal story about my family. And you might be thinking in the middle of this, why is she telling us this crazy story? But I promise there's a reason it brings us to the next activity that we're going to be doing. So I am married to my husband, Craig. We've been together for 27 years. He was a firefighter for 35 years. He's retired. We have 2 children. I have a 24-year-old daughter, Jessie, and I have a 26-year-old son, Colton. Well, when my daughter, Jessie, was little, she was a daisy picker. Now, some of you know what that is because you have a daisy picker in your family, but for those who don't, I will paint a little picture for you. Little blonde pigtails standing in the middle of the soccer field, staring at those little white daisies, smiling at her from the grass below. Meanwhile, of course, the other girls fly by, focused very intensely on that goal. Now, to be fair, occasionally Jessie did stop picking daisies so that she could chat with the girls on the other team. So she'd say things like, I like your ponytail holder. Would you be my friend? Now, I was always perfectly fine with this. I got, a latte, some conversation with the other moms. My daughter got a little fresh air. It was fine with me. My husband, on the other hand, not so much. Basically, I'm married to a gladiator. Every fiber of his being strives to win. I don't even like playing board games with him. So one day, we're at the soccer game. It's been about 20 minutes of daisy picking. And I look over at my husband, and he has this weird expression on his face, kind of this strained, like face turning purple. He actually looked like he was going to spontaneously implode. All of a sudden, he stands up, cups his hands over his mouth, and yells at the top of his lungs, and he's loud, Jessie, if you score a goal, I'll buy you a car. What? Okay, I'm just going to tell you right now, I laughed so hard I thought I was going to wet my pants. And I was not the only one. All of the parents on both teams were in complete hysterics, not at Jessie, but at my husband. First of all, you need to know that she was 6 years old at the time. 6. What in the world possessed him to offer her a car was beyond me. But the other thing you need to know about her, that child, she's a planner. She has always been that way, and she still is today. That child, that one thinks ahead. So I look over at my daughter, and I can just see the little wheels turning in her head. I will need a car one day. And then something amazing happened. My daughter, the daisy picker, turned to see who had the ball, and the girl who had it was clear at the other end of the soccer field. She takes off running straight at this poor child. I was kind of horrified, steals the ball from her, and proceeds to dribble the ball full speed down the entire length of the field, weaving in and out of every child standing in her way. She gets to the other end and drills that ball into the goal with so much force, there is no possible way the goalie could have stopped it. You have never seen such an eruption in your entire life. All of the parents on both teams stood up, cheering and yelling for Jessie, because he had just yelled this. Someone on the next field over was whistling for her. The girls on the other team, who of course my daughter's now friends with, are giving her high fives and saying, what kind of car are you going to buy? I look over at my husband, and he can't stand up. He's sitting in the chair with his mouth hanging open, just dumbfounded. Now, I may never know what he was thinking that day. Maybe he was trying to wrap his head around how much that car was going to cost him. And I'll just tell you, since she's a planner, she pretty much reminded him every month for the next 10 years. It cost him $6,000, by the way. Or maybe he was trying to comprehend how in 3 years of soccer, clearly his daughter could have been running and blocking and scoring goals, but for some bizarre reason beyond his comprehension, obviously she had chosen not to. But for me, it was one of those moments as a parent where you learn a profound and life-changing lesson from your child. Now, this is a generalization, but I know that little girls sometimes can be a little social when it comes to sports. But it just never occurred to me that a child could act with such intention She had been standing in the middle of a battlefield, basically, and chosen not to participate, knowing full well that a whole crowd of people probably thought she was incapable of doing what they thought she should be doing. She could not have cared less. She chose to do what felt right and what felt good and what felt true to her. She chose to delight in those little daisies that we get in the grass in the Northwest. She chose to compliment someone on the other team, heaven forbid, on their ponytail holder. She chose to make a new friend. And I thought to myself, how often do I get so caught up in what the world thinks I should be doing that I forget to listen to that still small voice in me, God in me, telling me what is right and what is true and what is good. You know, part of the reason I'm here tonight is I feel like there's so much divisiveness in the world today. All this negative rhetoric. We can't seem to get along with one another. And even in the Christian church with different denominations, whether it's about politics, whatever it is, people are judging each other, and we're doing a lot of this. And I feel like God is saying to me, will you turn from that, at least for a moment, will you turn from that and turn toward the one I love, another person created in my image? Will you turn toward that person? And that person may look different than me. That person may sound different than me, have a different background. But will you turn toward that person and say, will you be my friend? Will you abide in them the way I abide in you? Will you remain in them the way I remain in you? Will you start a conversation with them? So tonight, we get the opportunity to have a conversation. We are going to the library, the human library. So what's going to happen is, in a few minutes, a human library book is going to come and sit down at your table. Now, when we go to a library to check out a library book, oftentimes we learn something. So we might learn something about a person. We might learn about a topic or a place. And a lot of times when we check out a library book, we learn something about ourselves. So when they sit down, they're going to start by just sharing their name and sharing a little bit about their story so that you can start to kind of get to know who they are. And then we want you to learn more by asking them questions and just having a conversation with them. So you can start right into that once your library book sits down and starts the conversation. Now we're going to have some sample questions up on the screen just in case you get stuck or you feel like you're having trouble coming up with questions. I don't think that's going to be a problem because our library books are fascinating. This activity is going to be about 20 minutes, so at about 5 minutes, I'll give you a heads up that we'll need to wrap up our conversations. And afterward, we're going to spend first just a few minutes in silence, kind of reflecting on what that was like, just 2 or 3 minutes. And then we'll have some time at our tables to talk about it. What was that like? So 3 ground rules. Be kind. Your library book might be different than someone you've met before. Maybe you have some different opinions or you think differently about things. So we always want to use I words versus you words. Number 2, be curious. You might say, I wonder about this, or I feel this when I hear that, but maybe you felt differently when that happened. Be curious. Ask lots of questions. And also, number 3, don't be afraid of silence. A little bit of silence is okay. If you're having a conversation and maybe you need a minute to formulate a question, or the person you're talking to needs a minute to figure out how they want to answer, it's okay if there's a little bit of silence. Before your human library books join you, we'd like to give each table 1 minute. We're going to have you select one person at your table to have the conversation, and everyone else will observe. Now, there's a reason for this. It was intentional. We talked a lot about this. If we had the whole table asking the library book questions, it would feel more like a panel or an inquisition, or I can't remember the word Martine used, but it has a completely different feel than just having a conversation with someone one-on-one. So I'm going to give you 1 minute at each table to pick one person to have the conversation. And don't worry, because the people that are observing, you're going to have time later to reflect and talk about what this was like too. So you've got 1 minute, ready, go. All right. Does everybody have a conversation person? We're divided up, yes? A+. Good job. You guys did that quickly. All right, human library books. When you sit down at the table, just go ahead and start. You can share your name and tell your story. Maybe take about 5 minutes to share your story, whatever you want to share. And then the conversation person, just start asking questions. Martina is going to put some questions up on the screen that might help with the conversation if you get stuck. But enjoy. I'll give you when about 5 minutes. We have 5 minutes left. I'll let you know. All right. Well, I hate to interrupt you. There's some great conversations going on. Unfortunately, it's time to close the library. It's so sad. But library books, please stay at your tables. I'm going to give you a minute here. All right. Well, library books, stay at your tables if you would. Can we first of all give our library books a hand for sharing with us? Hopefully that was fun and interesting and engaging. So what we're going to do is first just take 2 to 3 minutes in silent reflection. If you want to close your eyes, that's okay. If you want to take a minute and just quietly jot down some notes. I'm just curious what that felt like. Not so much the story that your library book shared, but, and we've got questions up here too for you to just reflect on, but were there things about that experience that made you anxious? Like, was it awkward to start a conversation with somebody that you don't know that you might have had a lot of similarities, but there might have been some differences? Where did you see God in that conversation or in their story? Did parts of it give you energy? Did you find yourself curious as you talked to them? Did you have anything in common with your library book? Or maybe were there some differences that you found that came up? So we're going to give you 2 to 3 minutes. And then after this short, quiet time, we'll give you some table time as a group to just talk, not so much about the library book story, but just with the library book, all of you together, like, what was that like to have that conversation? So 2 to 3 minutes of quiet time to just reflect, and then I'll give you some table time. Thanks. Let's take just about 5 minutes and just talk with your table about what that experience was like, and maybe some ideas about what would it be like to bring that type of an experience into your community or to your church. And again, we've got questions up here, so just spend about 5 minutes talking to your table about what the experience itself was like. And then we're going to have one person from each table stand, if you will, and just maybe share with the group a couple of things that you heard. All right, go ahead. We've got about 5 minutes, and then we'll close this out. Yeah, just talk about what that experience was like of having a conversation with somebody new and different. All right. That is 5 minutes. So I'd like to ask, I think, again, we've got a couple of mics, if people are willing, and just good learning for me to hear what that was like. So I'd love to have one person from each table, if you'd be willing to stand up and just share some of the things you heard about what that experience was like to have that conversation with your human library book. So, sorry, I know it's really hard to stop the conversation.
All right, we've got a share over here.
Okay.
Don't make us ring the Tibetan singing bowl, because we will.
Well, that's right. I forgot about that.
So for our table, we really appreciated our human library because it puts him as the expert. And his story cannot be told by somebody else. In fact, he says, like, to share, everybody has a story to tell, and putting them at that spot gives them the opportunity to give that story, and he can only be the one to tell it the best. So I think that was one thing. And then I think from him, the human library, the opportunity for other people to listen is really important and key. And to know that they are curious and want to learn from him, I think was really important. And then just the value that you place on the human library and what we've learned in this. So I think it was the best experience. We're asking ourselves, can you use this in what we do? Can we replicate this in our work, wherever we are working? Yeah.
Great. Awesome. Another table?
You've got a mic.
Hi, everybody. So with our table, or more specifically with myself, when this idea of a human library was brought up, I've never heard about this. And so immediately I was taken with concern. I felt that referring to somebody as a human library was really objectifying them. There was this idea of, I went into questions like, are we paying them? Is it a volunteer basis? And it just seems that, that we're trying to have a conversation with somebody, and I feel that it would have been more natural if it wasn't referred into this type of setting. And the reason why all of these come up is because myself, I'm 29, so I'm kind of right at the millennial mark. And if millennials are looking for a transparent conversation, is this the way to have it? Is putting somebody on the spotlight because of their scenario or their life really what we should be doing? Because everybody has a story.
Sure.
So I think that's kind of the hesitancy that was going on here, but also I think that at the end of the day, there was good that came out of this. We all learned something at this table. So.
Great, thank you.
I'll just add a short part for myself, because I know Uriel, and so it was a great surprise to have him appear at our table. But also what I was reminded of is that when you think you know somebody's story, you don't know their story. And so we've had these conversations, and every time I meet him and hear a conversation about who he is, there's so much more.
Yeah.
And I think that was one of those reminders for me, is that it's like, oh yeah, I remember you told me this story, but when you told it again, it was like there's so much more going on, and that there's an inexhaustibility to who we are. And I'm just really thankful for stewarding his life, so that's great.
Great. All right, anybody else?
I need to go. I need to get to work. I would say that I kind of liked it, but kind of didn't like it. I thought the prompts were really good, but I think there's a part of we were talking about this, but with only one person asking the question, I think there were points where we wanted to follow up and have further connection, but we had to just stop it right there.
Yeah.
So it'd be like, oh, I know that person. And then we couldn't carry on, we couldn't, or oh, you should connect with, but then we can't do anything beyond
that's
that.
Funny.
So yeah, so it was good because because we got points of connection, but I didn't get to hear any of it from that. I felt like I was spewing out and oversharing. And I actually, we at my small group, we've been doing kind of similar spotlight things, and we get to have those interjections, and they go completely off the rails. And as a leader, I'm like, oh, I do not like this. This is taking half an hour longer than I'd like. But that's actually what people really loved about it. And so even though we don't get to get Mark's sermon discussion questions, people love that aspect of finding connection within each other, and I think we saw it within our conversation today.
Yeah. And we really loved hearing his story. We were very involved in it. We loved it, but it was frustrating because we couldn't,
Yeah, some of the tables, we kind of figured you'd break the rules. Some did. We had this whole debate over this. Do we do one-on-one, or do we table? Because what we didn't want is to kind of have this objectified thing. So we had this whole conversation about it. A lot of this is we're just experimenting. And I will say, I think in the World Vision setting, it just kind of wouldn't look like this. It'd be we take people on vision trips, and then they'd go have a conversation. You're just facilitating the opportunity to talk to somebody and share stories with each other. So this is kind of just a way to experience. So I really appreciate hearing all this feedback. So another table, I'd love to hear.
This is how you know you're old. I was going to go to the Issaquah Library and try to check out a human library. I thought you were talking for reals there.
They are there. They're not in every library, but if you Google the Human Library, it lists all the libraries all over the United States where they have it. Yeah.
Cool. Okay.
I kind of guessed that Issaquah Library probably does not have it. But
I'm going to check that out sometime. But we had a wonderful story that spanned far more time than it actually really happened in. And it was a story of God bringing a person to specific experiences to teach Albert what he wanted to teach him. And the hardest part was not being able to ask a question. I just was going to jump out of my skin at one point.
Good.
Right.
I love it.
I loved your vulnerability and your insight into your life. But I wondered what it was like for you.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was lucky to sit with three lovely ladies that were very invested in my story, and that just feels like an honor to be heard, And so I think everybody wants to be heard. And so I felt I felt like held in that you were all holding me in your gaze as well. Wow. So appreciate it.
Great. All right, I think Randy? Go ahead.
Yeah, the experience for our table was outstanding. And part of that largely due to just both our human library book and the question of being so fantastic. And it's just a natural flow conversation back and forth that I could see other scenarios that might be not quite, there might be some awkwardness, but in this case, it was just this fantastic exchange. But on a deeper level, what was really, the comment was made at our table of there's a learning that usually when we're engaging with each other, it's kind of a back and forth, and our going deeper into someone's story is limited. But in this exercise, it actually forced us to go deeper into someone's story and someone to have the courage to, and not just the courage, but just the be able to share the story in a deeper way than in a manner than what we usually go to. So that was a really great revelation.
Interesting. Thank you. All right. What tables have we not heard from, if you're willing to share? We've got up front here.
Yeah, I thought this was great. I like just having one questioner, and I was not it. It was very difficult for me, so it forced me to shut up and listen. And I thought Ed's story was compelling. We could see God's hand so clearly, and I noticed just how much deeper we went, and it was so good to absorb it. I was so antsy to talk, so then when we shared afterwards, I did all the sharing, and and some of that is I grew up next to a Hispanic family, and it's just so different from San Diego County up here. It's just, not only is there not much good Mexican food, but there's just hardly a Hispanic population here, or at least it just seems like much more African American, Asian, and so and just how isolated I am is so different from a multicultural high school that I grew up in neighborhood. So anyway, it was rich for me.
Wow. Well, that I hadn't thought about that, forcing you to listen. So that was an interesting, because we've gone back and forth. You let the whole group ask questions. So yeah, that's kind of interesting to think about. All right.
That's actually a perfect segue for what I felt was my experience was the pressure was off me to try and be thinking of the next question because I wasn't the person asking the questions. And so I could let go of the internal dialogue that you'd normally have waiting and just fully listen. And that was really nice. That relieved my anxiety because I wasn't trying to think of the next perfect thing to ask that would show my deep involvement. I could just be deeply involved. Right. And so that was really nice. And then, it forces you to wait. And then when you do feel those sense of connections, it's way more exciting. That relates. But you're also not trying to take over the conversation the way we naturally do. With our one-upping stories, oh, you did that, I did that too. Let me tell you about my story. Wait, it was your turn. So that eliminates that, which was really helpful. Yeah. So.
great. All right. Let's see. Did we get? Does anybody at this table? Do you want to share? Anyone?
Oh, it was loud. One of the things that I enjoyed is that how when Mark came up to this table, he introduced himself a little bit, and I feel like that just made me comfortable enough to, oh, okay, this is where he's at. But I did like how it was just one person asking the questions, because it did make me just listen. But also something that I pointed out was a lot of times back in my town, in my community, 80 to 60% of stories are always something tragic happened in the past. They went through it's just they talk about it in a way that's kind of hard for them to share. And what I loved about Mark was that he was super positive about his story. He was excited to share his story, but he was also happy and grateful for everything that happened. And so I feel like it's really awesome to hear a story in such a positive way. But I'm not saying that even for the people that say it in a negative way, I'm not saying that it doesn't have a positive outcome at all, because it does. But I just feel like a lot of times when someone's more happy about sharing the story, when they're more positive and they see the good in their struggles, it makes it so much more better for someone to hear, because it doesn't sound like they're complaining about their life, but they're just acknowledging it and letting you know, I went through this, but there's a better outcome.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Gosh, thank you everybody so much. That's such great, great feedback. Well, I just want to thank everybody for coming tonight and for learning with me and trying this out and seeing what we thought and giving me your feedback. My hope was not so much that we'd really finish a conversation, but just to start one. And that we would start thinking about the language we use to invite someone into a conversation. What does that look like? My prayer is that we begin to ask ourselves as churches and as organizations, if we're truly giving millennials agency. Jeff Hughes had a great point, just a little tiny example of this. When people at your church or your organization log on to your Wi-Fi, do they see two choices, guest and staff? Well, at World Vision they do. What are the things we're unconsciously doing that are separating us from them? Who holds the master key to your church or your organization? These are some great things to be thinking about. Jeff pointed some things out to me. Are we welcoming millennials to the table for a two-way dialogue, and are we trusting them with our elders, our pastors, our donors, our beneficiaries? Do we trust them to not try to filter that conversation? Just let them talk and have a relationship and a conversation. I hope this evening has generated some good questions so that you'll want to lean in and begin thinking about how to engage millennials in your work. Not just to continue our work as we go forward, but to spark that light in them of spiritual formation and spiritual transformation in their lives, and to use their really incredible gifts and talents, not just to carry our work forward, but to change the world really in a completely different way. They have so much to offer, to take the message of Jesus and the work of his hands farther really than we can even imagine. So I'll end with this. It's a prayer of reconciliation. Where there is separation, there is pain. Where there's pain, there's a story. And for their story, there is understanding and misunderstanding, listening and not listening. May we, separate peoples, estranged strangers, unfriended families, divided communities, turn toward each other with understanding and listening, with argument and acceptance, with challenge and change and consolation, because if God is to be found, God will be found in the space between. Amen. Well, if basically, we have allowed some extra time tonight for you guys to just continue the conversation. If you want to keep talking to each other or to your library books, we hope that you'll do that. Jeff might have some closing comments, but I just wanted to thank you for having me. God's blessings to you all. Thank you so much.
And just one more, just please thanks Kathy for her hard work for us tonight, and thank you. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
A couple of please keep the conversations going, and please, whatever you do, make sure that sugar and caffeine is in your body. We have desserts for you. So get some, come back to your table, continue the conversation if you're able to stay. We thank you so much for coming. Please go to our website, pivotnw.org, and find out more about what we're doing. We have events that are coming up. We'd like to make sure before you leave tonight, if we haven't got your name and contact information, we'd love to stay in touch with you if you want to stay in touch with us. Also, float around to other tables. And also, please, let's give a thanks to the people who stewarded their stories tonight at your tables, and let's thank them for doing that. This is a very risky thing as we kind of open ourselves, our hearts and ourselves to others in an event like this, and it was just a really gracious room. Godspeed to all of you, and blessings as you go into your time together. Thank you.